Imagine flying 1,300 miles over open ocean with nothing but a thin strip of horizon and a compass needle to tell you which way is home. Your fuel gauge is the constant conversation in your mind. Your radios chatter in fits and starts. Below you, the target is a city you've only ever seen on a map. Ahead of you waits a fight that until then, fighters had never been asked to make. Escort heavy bombers from a tiny volcanic island all the way to the Japanese mainland and back. That is the world the pilots of the so-called Tokyo Club stepped into in the spring of 1945. They were P-51 Mustang pilots, well-trained, stubborn, sometimes reckless men who were suddenly asked to stretch their fighters beyond anything the designers intended. Officially, these missions were an experiment in very long-range escort, VLR. Practically, they were one-way tests of endurance, navigation, and nerve. The captures of Iwo Jima and later of forward bases made it possible, but it did not make it safe. Before we go farther, the title of this film is blunt: The Insane Mustang Pilots That Finished Japan. That wording is meant to capture the scale and audacity of what these crews attempted. It's not a literal claim that a single squadron or aircraft type ended the war. They did not single-handedly win the war. What they did was help make Japan's skies increasingly untenable in the final months. Their missions inflicted crippling damage to air defenses, harried supply routes, and gave B-29 formations a fighting chance. That contribution came at a heavy cost. If you want more deep dives into World War II aviation, subscribe and hit the bell. This story only grows stranger the more you look at the details. Iwo Jima is a rock with a volcano at its center and saltwater scrub on its flanks. When the first Mustangs arrived, the island smelled of sulfur and cordite. There were no comfortable quarters, just tents and hastily dug shelters, the occasional concrete remnant of pre-war airstrips, and the constant low thump of distant artillery and ship guns. The ground was littered with the detritus of war: twisted metal, abandoned bunkers, and in the darker corners, human remains half buried in ash and sand. The pilots lived with wet clothes and thin mattresses and tried to sleep to the rhythm of incoming waves and watchful guards. The plan from Washington and the bomber commands was technically simple: place fighters close enough to the Japanese home islands so they could escort B-29s deep into the mainland airspace. Practically, it was anything but. The Mustangs were modified with extra fuel tanks. Long-range drop tanks hung beneath the wings, and sometimes a fuselage tank behind the pilot. Still, the margin for error was thin. The P-51 was brilliant at high-altitude speed and range when everything worked, but give it volcanic ash in the intake, fouled radios, frozen guns, or inexperienced navigators, and its advantages could evaporate. Navigation was a daily crisis.
Over the Pacific, there are no roads, no recognizable coastlines for long stretches, and on many missions, the fighters flew by dead reckoning and blacked-out compasses. The B-29s acted as mobile beacons. Skilled lead navigators aboard bomber formations would vector the fighters toward the target. A single miscalculation, a cloud cover that hid the sun, a stray piece of ash inside an oil line, any of those could turn a carefully calculated 13-hour mission into a desperate gamble. Men learned quickly that a long-range escort was not only about gunnery and tactics, but also about fuel arithmetic and blind trust in a plan that might disintegrate on contact with weather. Mechanically, the environment at Iwo was a menace. Volcanic ash coated the world like a gray film. It choked carburetors, scoured instruments, and hid seams on canvas tents. Radios crackled and went silent. Machine guns would heat, then jam. The carefully calibrated gun sight could fog over. The Japanese defense system was adapting too. Fighter types varied, and some interceptors like the J-2M Raiden were fast-climbing threats that demanded immediate respect. New pilots arriving from training often lacked experience over water. There was an acute shortage of navigators who could guide a formation over 600 miles of nothing and bring them home intact. And then there were the quiet cruelties of survival equipment that failed when needed most. Life jackets were a topic of obsession. Lieutenant Colonel Joseph "Smokey" Walther, the unit's flight surgeon, took it on himself to test the life vests. The story that runs through unit records and later accounts is simple and chilling. The standard-issue vests were reputedly unreliable when used under actual combat conditions. Walther, frustrated by reports of men drowning after ditching, volunteered to be lowered into the water to see how the CO2 inflation systems behaved. The tests were not dramatic moments of a Hollywood hero. They were medical procedure and stubborn care. The aim was to save lives, to find whether a different kit or simple maintenance might reduce the number of pilots lost to the sea. The tests and subsequent changes mattered. Not every man returned for another mission, but for those who did, the small improvements were everything. Living conditions worsened morale in a way that sometimes matters more than technical fixes. Men who had spent months on forward bases were both physically drained and continually reminded that death could arrive by a slam of altitude, a misfire, or a nav error. Some pilots developed rituals, carefully folding their flight gloves, checking a compass twice, small acts that calmed their hands. Others drank quietly. the medical officers arranged for occasional trips to hot springs on Okinawa when possible. Those baths, steaming over volcanic rock, became a kind of sacrament. For a few hours, the men could be washed of the grit and the smell of ash and feel human again.
It did not erase losses, but it restored a little of the discipline and cleanliness the flying life required. The first real test came on April 7, 1945. Up until then, fighters had been largely escorts within reach of American bases. This flight was different. The objective was straightforward yet audacious. A B-29 strike on the Tokyo-Yokohama area, with Mustangs from the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups, collectively tagged in records and press as the Tokyo Club, flying out from Iwo to meet the bomber stream, provide fighter cover over the target, and then return, all within the careful margins of fuel consumption and wind. The morning started cold at altitude. You look out and see the B-29s, massive, cumbersome forms in the thin air like silver islands. The Mustangs form up, a ribbon of polished aluminum, the sun catching the radials. The rendezvous is tense. If you miss it, you are on your own, probably out of fuel before you can get home. Over the Tokyo approaches, the airspace is a living, moving threat. Radar had limited reach. Japanese radar and ground controllers still tried to vector their fighters. Interceptors come up, fast, tenacious, sometimes better at the climb than at long, sustained fights. The dogfight itself, as the unit reports and gun camera stills imply, is brutal and close. Tracer threads cross the sky, singeing paint and catching on fabric. The Mustangs do what they were built for, use speed and boom and zoom tactics to try to engage and then disengage, trading energy for position. According to unit records, the Mustangs scored several early kills on that April day, and more important, they were effective enough to reduce bomber losses. For the B-29 crews, that mattered more than headline claims. Commanders watching the screens and listening to radios could feel a change in the probability calculus. With fighters in attendance, bomber crews could focus more on bombing and less on slipping through the trap of interceptors. Individual names begin to appear in the reports. Major Jim Tapp is recorded among early scores, his name rising in the unit's lists. Captain Todd Moore also emerges as a prominent figure, his score climbing in mission debriefs as the spring wears on. These men and others become the nucleus of the Tokyo Club narrative, the faces that future histories will focus on when trying to pair a complex campaign into characters. Unit records list claims and credit, and historians later sort those against Japanese records. In wartime reporting, there is a recognized gap between reported kills and confirmed enemy losses, a gap we'll come back to. For now, the immediate fact stands. April 7th demonstrated that VLR Escort could work in principle. It restored morale on the bombers, and it convinced planners to press further. But success was partial and accompanied by a string of close misses. April 12th brought a reminder that even a small advantage could come at devastating cost.
Unit logs from mid-April note several pilots lost on missions that should have been routine. The list of names grows longer in the margins of flyby reports. First Lieutenant James Beanie recorded in after-action notes as being hit and lost after engagement with a J-2M Raiden. First Lieutenant Fred White, whose aircraft suffered damage that led to catastrophic failure and a fatal crash. First Lieutenant James Whiteman, listed as lost over open water after anti-aircraft fire disabled his plane, and his chute did not bring him home. Each name in the ledger is a small headline in the camp. The mess hall quiets for a day, prayer cards are pinned to tents, and the scramble briefings carry an added weight. Danger in these missions came from many sources beyond the enemy. Parachute and life vest failures, a design flaw in a CO2 canister, a seam that opened on a drop tank at 20,000 feet. Such failures could turn a skilled pilot into a victim of circumstance. Aircraft could be forced down by cannon bursts that didn't even crack the cockpit but severed a fuel line. Men could be knocked unconscious in a barrage and go under before anyone could reach them. The ocean does not forgive mistakes easily. The Pacific is an unblinking witness that swallows planes and people without ceremony. There are small stories that underline how improvisation and stubbornness often made the difference between life and death. In one report, First Lieutenant Robert Scamra is recorded as having been separated from his flight, but continuing to circle a damaged B-29 until the bomber limped back over friendly water. Scamra's gun camera footage, mentioned in squadron notes, shows him breaking off only when the bomber crew signaled that repairs held. Stories like that were passed around in briefings, not as folklore, but as operational lessons. Don't abandon a crippled bomber if you can help it. Keep visual contact, watch fuel carefully. These are the kinds of rules that become the backbone of survival. Even with growing lists of losses, the Mustangs kept flying. The men adapted tactics to the mission realities. They dropped to lower altitudes when interceptor threats were high, they learned to use clouds as cover or as hazards depending on fuel state, and they began to rely on an informal culture of cross-checks. Two pilots would verify each other's nav fixes, a wingman would watch the lead's fuel burn and speak up if it seemed off.
That kind of mutual accountability saved lives in planes. The April missions also revealed the psychological impact of the VLR concept. Pilots described the sense of being a small thing in a vast sky, cut off from base and dependent on a knot of steel and a fragile line of fuel. Some men, new to the Pacific, found their hands shaking before takeoff, despite the familiarity of their aircraft. Others became almost calm in their routines, a kind of cold competence that bordered on the detached.
That detachment had a cost. It hardened some men and eroded the communal buffer that helps people cope with repeated trauma. Technically, the Mustangs were stretched to do things they weren't originally designed for. At high altitude, fighters could encounter compressibility, an aerodynamic phenomenon where controls feel sluggish and the aircraft behaves unpredictably as air density and shock waves change around the wing. Pilots learned how to manage compressibility by adjusting their dives and recovery speeds and by keeping an eye on indicated airspeed rather than instinct alone. The long-range tanks changed aircraft handling characteristics. Some pilots reported that the extra weight made the Mustang less nimble in close fights. Mechanical issues like gun jams were often explained away at debriefings as the cumulative result of repeated hard firing at long ranges, cooling cycles at altitude, and inferior ammunition batches. By the end of April, unit leaders were balancing two competing realities: the tactical value of escorting B-29s over the Japanese mainland and the rising human price of sending fighters so far from home. The bomber crews were grateful and more confident. The commanders saw a way to force air superiority over critical areas. Yet the pilots on the front line knew the arithmetic in a way the planners sometimes chose to forget. Each escort was a coin flip against weather and mechanical fate. Then April turned to May, and the nature of the missions began to broaden. Escort was no longer the only mission profile. Patrols over occupied islands and airfields, sweeps to counter kamikaze staging areas, and low-level attacks on ships and airstrips began to occupy more of the Mustang's time. The transition from high-altitude guardian to strafing intruder carried new risks. Low-level attacks exposed pilots to concentrated ground fire, small-caliber anti-aircraft guns that could shred a control surface or a fuel tank. A Mustang that was effective at 25,000 feet could be suddenly fragile at treetop level. One of the more sobering adjustments came when the pilots encountered kamikaze tactics. These were not a novelty, but their frequency rose as Japan resorted to increasingly desperate methods to blunt the American approach. Structurally, a kamikaze attack was often short and brutal, a single aircraft with a single purpose, aiming at maximum damage. Fighters tried to intercept before the attackers closed to effective crash range. Destroyers relied on radar and concentrated AA fire. For the Mustangs, the kamikaze threat meant flying patrols where the margin for error shrank and the tactical picture could change in the beat of a wing. There was a particular taste of irony in how the pilots handled morale. After too many long missions, commanders recognized that combat fatigue would degrade performance.
It's recorded in the logs that when they could, flight surgeons and senior officers arranged short, controlled respites, clean clothes, warm water, chance for letters to arrive and be read. Walther's life vest tests were practical steps. The hot springs and a day or two of freedom were psychological triage. Men came back to the line with a small piece of themselves restored and a new resolve to fly their next mission with an extra measure of caution. Through late April and early May, names continued to populate the casualty lists, but so did tallies of enemy aircraft destroyed. Unit reports began to note that the Mustangs were claiming significant numbers of both air-to-air and ground kills. These claims had an operational effect. Japanese pilots increasingly found themselves outmatched in some sectors, and supply runs and airfields suffered from targeted attacks. Yet historians and analysts caution about raw tallies. Combat claims from pilots are, by necessity, immediate and imperfect assessments, and many wartime claims were later adjusted when matched to enemy records. Still, the cumulative pressure was real. The Tokyo Club was making it harder for Japan to move men and material by air with impunity. As May advanced, another practical problem that had been simmering came into focus: crew fatigue, in the form of navigational errors that were not strictly mechanical. Pilots and navigators were human. Hours added up and mistakes grew more likely. A single flight plan misread or a compass misaligned by a few degrees multiplied over hundreds of miles into a gap big enough to leave a fighter alone over open sea. Isolation amplifies human error. Where a 2-degree navigation error over land might be covered by a road or radio transmission, over the Pacific it becomes existential. The operational tempo also meant that lessons had to be learned quickly and communicated faster than the men could forget them. After-action debriefs moved from casual conversations in the mess to formal bulletins that circulated among squadrons.
They discussed everything: optimal fuel reserves for return legs, the timing of escort handoffs, the importance of maintaining radio discipline to avoid chaotic chatter during engagements. Plans for better equipment maintenance and for more conservative fuel margins were proposed. The flight surgeons pushed for better life vests and for inspections of parachute harnesses. Commanders did what commanders often do in war. They tried to balance ambition with caution, learning from each cost until the lesson became blunt enough to be undeniable. And yet, despite these adjustments, there was a persistent sense of being on a long slope with steep, unseen edges. The April missions had proved the concept. They had also shown the fragility of the program. Men who had flown those early missions could sense that what had worked once could fail spectacularly the next day. They tightened their knots and checked their straps.
They memorized alternate airfields and plotted emergency sea lanes. But none of that could completely answer the hazard of a sudden storm, an unlucky piece of flak, or a mechanical failure in the wrong place at the wrong time. By early June, the mood had shifted from the brittle optimism of April to a more somber concentration. Records from late May show increased urgency in briefings. Weather windows were now as critical as enemy dispositions. The planners continued to schedule missions, confident that learned protocols would carry the day. The pilots, for their part, kept making the decision to climb into their Mustangs and point them toward the mainland, into a sky that had become familiar in its hostility. A single line in the operational logs, small, clinical, and almost mundane, captures that suspended moment. Mass escort operations scheduled for 01 June. Flight lead, B-29 guidance. That sentence, bureaucratic and neutral, was a hinge. It turned out to be one of those decisions that separate the ordinary cadence of operations from a calamity. The pilots did not know it yet. They prepared as they had for dozens of missions before, checked fuel and flak jackets, listened to the brief, and strapped in. The transmissions in the ready room have the same rhythm on most days: weather, route, brief tactical considerations, and the standard warnings about fuel. No one spoke of catastrophe in a concrete way. The possibility of loss was always present, but the language used to contain it tends to be procedural. Still, history is not made from procedural alone. It is made from the inevitable collision of plans and reality, and by June 1, the collision, when it came, would be catastrophic in a way that none of the men had expected. The pilots launched that morning into what had been briefed as marginal weather. Clouds were expected. They were briefed to use them as concealment rather than hazard. The B-29, which would guide them, the navigational beacon for a formation of fighters, was tasked with flying a precise course through a lane of storms. On paper it was possible. On the day, the atmosphere offered no quarter. The rest of that day, the part that breaks the narrative into before and after, belongs to what later would be called, in unit correspondence and veteran testimony, Black Friday. But that, and the stories that followed directly from it, are a separate chapter. For now, the pilots are still airborne in April and May. They have proven the VLR concept, adapted tactics, and endured losses that carve quiet places in their ranks. They are, in equal measure, more capable than they were in March, and more vulnerable than they ever wanted to be. We pause here at the late spring of 1945, a moment where audacity and exhaustion sit in the same briefing room. The Tokyo Club has proven a concept and paid dearly for it.
They have shown that fighters can reach the Japanese mainland and fight there, and they have learned, often by grim trial, what that reality demands. The next series of missions will push that knowledge further, press the limits, and test the thin seam between ingenuity and disaster. When June arrives, the weather no longer feels like background noise. It becomes a decision, one that commanders, navigators, and pilots hinge every mission upon. On June 1st, the flight is scheduled the way many have been: a mass escort, B-29 guidance, the same checklist, the same tightened straps. On paper, it is routine. In the sky, it becomes anything but. They climb into a murk that the briefing never fully captured. For hours, the fighters ride in the bomber stream, the B-29s forming a slow silver highway toward the home islands. Then the clouds thicken. Visibility drops to a few hundred feet. The world becomes a moving, heaving thing. The lead B-29 is supposed to be the group's compass. Instead, its radio reports and navigation instruments start to falter. Ash-blurred antennas, static, and a pilot who can no longer see the horizon. A navigator who had been flawless for 10 missions makes a minor correction that the formation doesn't register until it's too late. What follows is not a single catastrophe, but a chain reaction. Clouds shear the formation into fragments. Wingmen lose sight of leaders. Fuel calculations that worked on a clear day now become questions with sharp edges. Some pilots push on toward the target because doctrine and duty demand it. Others turn when the needle on the tank drops past the conservative line they've agreed to. In scattered pockets across the sky, aircraft begin to separate. Radio voices overlap and then vanish, and the Pacific becomes an expanse with teeth. Black Friday, as survivors call it, is a catalog of small failures colliding into a disaster. Planes fly into one another in the gray. Mid-air collisions when two Mustangs, each trying to arrest a dive or reclaim position, misjudge closing speed. Others hit the sea after sustaining damage that is survivable in theory, but not in the fractured reality of disorganization and exhaustion. Pilots bail out, but waves are rough. Life vests sometimes fail to inflate. Harnesses are knotted wrong. Rescue craft are hours away. In some cases, bailing out means entering a storm-churned ocean with visibility so poor that even the carved outline of nearby ships is a rumor. Unit records and survivor accounts tally the losses with a blunt impartiality. Of the mass escort operation, dozens of fighters are separated or lost. 148 aircraft were involved in the larger operation, and by the end of the day, unit reports list roughly 24 pilots missing or killed. Small flights, entire sections of 4 or 6 planes, simply never return.
Names appear on the casualty boards in tight columns. Men like Lieutenant Richard Schroepel, who some reports note was shot down over a harbor and did not make it back from the water. Lieutenant James B., recorded as lost after contact with a J-2M Raiden. The ledger keeps a steady, tragic rhythm. It's impossible to overstate what this does to morale. The men do not need a lecture on risk. They have watched comrades vanish into foam. But until that week, many losses had felt discreet. An unlucky dogfight, a single error. Black Friday reframes the entire enterprise. Now, any flight into marginal weather has a new shadow, the possibility not merely of being shot down by the enemy, but of being erased by the sky itself. Survivors later described the day in terms that mix the mechanical and the human. Broken radios clattering with disconnected fragments of commands, the sudden sick feeling when formation discipline falls away, the choking gray ash that sometimes drifts like a slow sleet over wings and windshields. Where gunfire and flak leave clean wounds, weather and navigational confusion leave wounds that are diffuse and cruel. You can fix a torn wing, but you cannot always fix the judgment that causes two planes to occupy the same cubic space. Command reacts with the kind of urgency wartime demands. Investigations roll out in tempers and informal minutes. Flight leads are asked to explain their choices. Navigation officers pore over briefings, charts, and compass readings. The medical staff tally more than wounds. They catalog the corrosion of nerve, the thin glove of chronic fear that begins to grip pilots who have seen formation mates go under. Concrete steps are ordered, more conservative fuel margins, explicit rules about cloud penetration, stricter cross-checks for navigator changes at the last minute. Those procedural changes do not bring back the dead, but they begin to alter the calculus. And yet the unit, as units do, keeps flying. War is not an enterprise that pauses for grief. Only a little over a week later, on June 10th, the same pilots who had been hollowed by losses fly out again, and they fly with a focus that looks from the ground like fury. The mission that day is cleaner in weather and more ruthless in execution. Unit records show a dramatic turnaround. The Mustangs claim 24 enemy aircraft in one series of engagements, and do so with no reported losses for the escorting fighters. The pilots correct tactics, they tighten formations, and their gunnery is precise. For the men on the receiving end, Japanese interception flights and airfields, the hit is an acute shock. How much weight to place on claims is always a historian's puzzle. Pilot reports are immediate. They are written with the heat of combat in ink that sometimes runs. Later analysis often reduces those numbers when cross-checked against enemy logs. Still, the operational effect of that June 10th operation is beyond dispute.
It restores confidence to bomber crews, gives the fighters a psychological boost after Black Friday, and signals to Japanese defenses that the air war is both persistent and increasingly unforgiving. After that reprisal, the nature of Mustang operations takes a discernible turn. Escorted bomber work continues, but Mustangs expand their role into sustained strafing and ground attack missions. The logic is simple. If the enemy can no longer guarantee air superiority or protect ground targets effectively, then fighters can switch roles and hit airfields, supply trains, and coastal shipping. Low-level attacks are the new currency of attrition. They are effective, and they are dangerous. Flying low to ground attack invites a different kind of hazard. Anti-aircraft batteries designed to punch at ships or protect airfields become lethal at treetop altitudes. A small caliber burst can spin a control surface, jam a rudder, or punch an oil line that translates into sudden loss of power.
Pilots who had been comfortable with high-altitude dogfights now face concentrated flak and the risk that even if they survive to eject, rescue will be far from guaranteed. The Mustang's long noses, the product of their additional tanks, make them harder to handle at low speed. Stalls at low altitude are unforgiving. Still, these missions succeed in striking critical targets. Airfields that once launched interceptors are disrupted. Supply and repair lines suffer damage. Ships and barges in coastal waters come under repeated attack. Squadron logs begin to show a pattern. The fighters are not simply escorting, they are grinding down the infrastructure that supports Japanese air operations. The cumulative effect is strategic: supply shortages, delayed repairs, and fewer sorties from Japanese airfields. Human stories thread through these operations. Major Jim Tap Tap and Captain Todd Moore continue to be names in the reports, aces whose tallies rise as seasons change. But alongside the celebrated scores are quieter, harsher tales. Lieutenant Fred White, lost in April under tragic circumstances, is not a headline so much as a fixed absence in a barracks roster. Other pilots suffer injuries that leave them forever changed. Some return to flight but carry scars that are as much about nerves as flesh. The squadron's medical and support staff, led by officers like Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Smokey Walther, keep trying to reduce those absences. Walther's earlier tests on life vests were only the beginning. Following Black Friday, procedures for maintenance and survival gear are overhauled. CO2 inflator canisters are inspected more frequently. Life vests are reissued where failures are suspected. Parachute harness inspections move from being perfunctory to ceremonial in their thoroughness. Combat readiness begins to include a checklist that is explicitly about bringing the man back alive, not merely the aircraft. There are other, more human attempts to mend what is fraying.
The hot springs trips expand, and officers find ways to rotate pilots off the line for brief rests and cleaner clothes. Mail arrives in irregular waves, and the arrival of a letter can swing a man's mood more than a medal might. Commanders authorize small luxuries, ice cream on a rare day, an extra hour of sleep, and these gestures, pragmatic and small, help rebuild a unit's moral fiber. They don't fix the math of risk, but they let men feel human again long enough to fly. The Tokyo Club's pilots also find themselves learning lessons about claiming victory and measuring success. Unit reports are careful to say reported kills or claims, and historians later use those qualifiers heavily. Combat reports tend to be optimistic, sometimes by necessity. The fog of war and the adrenaline of engagement conspire to make every tracer flash feel like a certain kill. Still, no matter the final reconciliations, the practical impact is what matters. Japanese interceptors are pressed harder, airfields are damaged, and the margin for operational freedom on the home islands narrows. By midsummer, the tempo of operations begins to change another way. With Japan's capacity increasingly constrained, planners use Mustangs more often in interdiction roles, attacking railheads, strafing convoys, and harassing coastal traffic. The logic follows a familiar wartime pattern. When direct strategic outcomes are ambiguous, pressure is applied across many small points until the cumulative stress fractures an enemy's ability to respond. The Tokyo Club pilots find themselves as both guardians for the B-29s and as frontline raiders, sometimes within the same week. Casualties keep coming. The ledger grows in ways that make even the hardened officers wince. By the end of the campaign that spring and summer, unit records compiled in the months that followed list losses that are painfully specific. Roughly 130 Mustangs lost and 121 men killed, missing, or captured in the operations attributed to these very long-range missions. Those figures are an attempt to set a hard edge on a messy reality. Historians later cross-check such totals and often adjust them when comparing Allied claims with Japanese archives. Unit records also report hundreds of Japanese aircraft destroyed both in the air and on the ground, numbers that speak to the intensity of pressure the fighters were applying. Again, vintage claims need cautious reading, but the strategic effect, airfields degraded, fewer interceptors operating reliably, supply lines stressed, was real. One of the most important things to recognize is that these missions were not a single cinematic stroke that finished Japan. They were part of a larger multi-domain squeeze: sustained strategic bombing, naval blockades, submarine campaigns, and the sheer erosion of material and morale inside Japan. The Mustang's VLR missions were a particularly visible and risky facet of that pressure.
They pressed the envelope of fighter capability farther than anyone had expected, and in doing so, forced Japanese air defenses to operate at a deficit. In short, they were instrumental in tightening the noose, not the sole cause of collapse. Individual acts of bravery and loss are worth naming because history is not only a list of numbers. The record remembers men like First Lieutenant Robert Scamra, who was noted for staying with a damaged B-29 until it could limp clear of immediate danger. Pilots who chose to remain in a fight to ensure their bombers could reach home. It remembers the medical officers who risked routine, unromantic work, repacking parachutes, testing CO2 cartridges, scrubbing life vests, and how their attention likely saved as many lives as any last-minute dive or climb. It remembers flights that departed and never came back, and mess halls that learned the ritual of quiet when a name was added to the list. The Tokyo Club's legacy is therefore a complicated one. Tactical innovation born of necessity, bravery pushed to extremes, and a human cost that reshapes the story at every turn. In public memory, it is tempting to carve simple narratives, heroes who did X, Y, Z and thereby solved a problem. The real story requires a different appetite, the patience to hold contradiction. These pilots did extraordinary things. They also paid for those deeds with lives, the loss of young airmen to weather and shell and flawed equipment. They extended range, experimented in tactics, and forced an enemy to disperse resources that might otherwise have concentrated on the bombers. That is a kind of finishing, piecemeal, bloody, and strategically consequential, but it is not the same as a single conquering blow. After the operations, the military machine begins to institutionalize what worked and to try to make durable the small innovations born in crisis. Nav training emphasizes overwater dead reckoning and redundant fixes. Pre-flight checks add steps specifically focused on VLR peculiarities, alternate field planning, conservative fuel margins, and stricter watch on the physical state of long-range tanks. Logbooks carry new bulletins about oil line inspections and about the behavior of guns at altitude, so that pilots do not discover a jam at 20,000 feet when their options are limited. Life vests are tested more frequently and replacement policies clarified. The lessons are technical, sometimes boring, and always practical, and in their accumulation they make future flights incrementally safer. Memory, too, is a battlefield. The men who flew yield to the archive, to photographs, to the narratives written in the years that follow. Some are lionized, others are forgotten. Where histories focus on aces and lists, the lived texture of the operations is often subtler. Fatigue, boredom punctured by terror, the bureaucratic grind. So veterans' reunions and the scattered memoirs become vital.
The accounts that survive, debriefs, letters, and unit logs, carry an immediacy that later summations cannot match. They speak of the smell of ash in a cockpit, the small grace of clean socks after weeks, of learning to sleep with one ear always listening for a change in the wind that might mean trouble. We now consider the broader tally with a historian's caution. Unit records report hundreds of Japanese aircraft destroyed in air and on the ground, and roughly 130 Mustangs lost, with about 121 men killed or captured during these VLR and follow-on operations. Those unit figures reflect the reality of sustained pressure and of a campaign that wore down defenses through repeated high-risk sorties. They also underline the human arithmetic of the late Pacific War. Strategic gains often demanded tactical bravery and exacted heavy human cost. There is one final moral to take from the story, the paradox that defines much of modern aerial warfare. Technology grants reach. Reach invites imagination. Imagination generates new risk, which technology then must mitigate. The P-51 Mustang was a marvelous airplane, fast, efficient, and flexible. But it did not come with a guarantee for pilots when the mission called for twice the intended range, when ash fouled intakes, and when storms could shred formations. The pilots of the Tokyo Club asked the airplane to do something extraordinary. In many missions it delivered. In others, the limits of metal, weather, and human endurance were merciless. So what do we call what they did? There is no single word that fits. Insane captures the audacity, the kind of risk-taking that looks unreasonable on paper. Heroic risks turning individual courage into uncritical praise that ignores the cost. Instrumental is accurate in strategic terms, but cold in tone. The least dishonest summary is this: these were daring pilots who undertook extreme missions that materially tightened the military noose around Japan in its final months. They did so at tremendous cost to themselves. They did not single-handedly win the war, but their willingness to push the P-51 beyond conventional limits helped make Japan's skies increasingly untenable. At the end of the mission lists, at the back of debrief folders, are the names. We read them not as lines on a ledger, but as anchors. Major Jim Tap Tap, Captain Todd Moore, Lieutenant Robert Scamra, Lieutenant Richard Schraubel, Lieutenant James Bay, Lieutenant Fred White, Lieutenant James Whiteman, men who are markers in a campaign that was part tactical experiment, part technological extension, and part human endurance trial. Their stories are the thin filament that connects mechanical history to human consequence. What remains, decades later, is a complicated legacy. Aircraft, squadrons, and claim tallies become entries in histories and databases.
Monuments and reunions sustain memory.
And for anyone who studies these missions, the most lasting impression is often not a number, but a set of images. Mustangs slicing a pale sky toward a distant city, pilots checking compasses under the ghostly light of a pre-dawn, a medic meticulously packing a parachute, a commander deciding, against a stack of probabilities, to order another escort. Those images are fuller than claims or losses alone because they contain both the technical and the human. We close where we began, in the cockpit, looking out at a distant coastline, the fuel gauge a whisper of time, the sky enormous and indifferent. The Tokyo Club pilots lived in that tension. They did the insane work of bringing fighters face to face with the mainland, pushing machinery and men to an edge that left behind lessons, grief, and a hard-earned strategic value. Their missions helped accelerate the erosion of Japan's ability to defend its skies and sustain its operations. That is a legacy worthy of sober respect. If this story resonated with you and you want more deep dives into World War II aviation, missions, machines, and the men who flew them, please consider supporting the channel or checking out the archive links in the description. Your support helps fund careful research and preserves the memory of those who paid the highest price.